Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Richard Juliani, author of Little Italy in the Great War.
Richard Juliani, author of Little Italy in the Great War, Philadelphia's Italians on the Battlefield and the Home Front. Why'd you write the book?
Good question. I've often asked that of myself, and I think you'll be surprised at the answer because you are part of it. As I reflect on how this came about, I realized that it wasn't my choice. It chose me. The subject chose me rather than I chose it. But I think there were three things that I can identify that were to some extent involved. One was the fact of growing up in an immigrant family during the Second World War and hearing my father talk about the war and talk about his experiences in the war. But he was talking about the experiences of a veteran of the Italian infantry in the First World War, which he was. He was very fortunate. He reached Mestre, which was the jumping off point for the front line, on November 4th, which was the day the armistice was signed on the Italian front. It's a week earlier than the Western Front. But I used to hear a great deal about his adventures as a soldier, even though he was fortunate enough not to get to the ugly battle line which devastated so many lives. I grew up very much aware of the Great War. Second thing that happened much later on that further nourished my interest in this subject was when I was doing my doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania, when I was doing research, I was in South Philadelphia in public parks, which were gathering places for elderly immigrant men. And I was tape recording what they were willing to tell me about their lives. And I uncovered a number of them, a handful of them, but quite a few, who said that one of the reasons they came to America, when I asked them the question of why did you leave Italy and why did you come to America, some of them were willing to admit that it was partly the conscription laws of Italy, and they had no interest in serving in the military. And these are men who had come before the war, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. This was in the late 1960s, early 1970s, I was doing the interviews. And they said, I didn't want to go into the Italian army. I had no use for military life. And then they would hit me with the punchline. The punchline was, and you know what happened to me after I got here? I ended up a doughboy on the Western Front in the U.S. Army. I began to learn as I furthered my own reading and along these lines that they had served quite notably, quite honorably. They were cannon fodder. They were much like current minorities, such as our Puerto Ricans, who show up sometimes in strangely large numbers in the military life. But this was an opportunity for young Italian immigrant boys who first went into the Pennsylvania National Guard. And then when it was federalized, when we entered the war in 1917, and you get the Italian Brigade, part of the Pennsylvania National Guard initially, and then later part of the Federal Army, the Federalized National Army. And the third thing that kind of tickled me was the last interview that we did, because toward the end of the interview, or maybe right after the interview, as we continued our conversation, you said to me at one point, as we talked about the Great War, you said, oh yes, Italy was on our side during that conflict, wasn't it? And your hesitation kind of needled me a little bit. And I thought, gee, I wonder if there are many Americans who don't realize that Italy was allied with the United States and France and Great Britain and Russia in the Great War. So all of these things kind of rotated in my mind a bit, revolved around in my mind, and they truly did. I mean, even that little episode involving you, and I have mentioned it at times to other people, and here was an interviewer who was a very well-informed, sophisticated guy who kind of surprised me when he paused for a moment in asking this question. So I thought there was a huge gap that had to be filled. And I began to find more and more material. I think I went into it first by trying to look at that period of immigrant history in which an immigrant population, and they were not the only immigrant population to be in this situation, of course, found themselves facing the first really great international involvement of the United States. For them, fortunately, their participation was in alliance with the United States, their new nation. But for many others in Philadelphia, of course, we had a large German population, which I've been researching in recent years. We had a large Austrian population. We had a large Polish population, and they were going to find themselves in a more complicated and more difficult situation. But being primarily preoccupied with the Italians, I thought it would be enough for me to deal with the Italians. As I got into that, the ramifications suddenly sprouted. And I began to find a number of other aspects that I wanted to deal with. For example, what was the reaction of the civilian population in the immigrant community when war is declared? And the Great War begins in August of 1914. Italy does not enter until May of 1915. When Italy enters, when Italy declares its involvement in the war and launches an assault against the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the northeastern border of their country, Little Italy explodes in patriotic fervor.
Well, just for the record, you said Italy entered the war in 1915?
1915.
When did the U.S. enter the war?
1917.
So there was 2 years that Italy was in the war, the U.S. was not in the war. Okay.
And for the U.S., it's a very difficult time because we know the war is inevitable for us. And we almost know that it is inevitable that we will go in on the Allied side. But President Wilson has declared a policy of neutrality, and on the surface, we're supposed to be non-committal as far as which side we will be on. But I think most people understood that once we get into the war, it's going to be with the British, our closest foreign relations, and we will be with the Allies. What happens, however, in 1917, as we discover, we do not have a very large standing army, and we are not prepared. It isn't until spring of 1918, almost summer of 1918, that a large military commitment is made by the United States, and there's only a few weeks left to the war. The big buildup, the big move made by the U.S. Army, ground army, is in June of 1918. We suffer, by comparison, about 125,000 deaths, which over the short period that we were in the war from that initial engagement in June of 1918 till the armistice in early November of 1918, it's actually a very large rate of casualty. But in terms of total numbers, it doesn't compare at all with Italy, who loses 650,000 men. Although most of the men dying during the war in all armies were not dying from battlefield wounds and battlefield circumstances, but from the influenza and from other circumstances. England and France have enormous losses in the millions, several million each, and Russia's losses are so large that they are sometimes given as incalculable.
Why was Italy in the war in the first place? What did they have against Austria?
Again, a difficult question to answer, and a question that was not entirely answered when Italy went into the war, because there was great division within the Italian population. There was a strong anti-war sentiment. But Italy eventually does make the war faction does prevail, and Italy does make the move. Italy has, for one answer to that question, Italy covets a certain piece of territory in the northeast corner that is going to complete what we know as modern geographical Italy. And Italy had long coveted that piece of turf, Italia irredenta, unclaimed Italy, unredeemed Italy. But Italy has also had centuries of difficulty in its relationship to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, Italy, of course, does not become a modern nation, a solidified, consolidated modern nation until the early 1860s. It expands with additional acquisitions of land in the early 1870s, but there's a small parcel of land that it is thought, and part of it goes back to even Dante, writing about Italy, fair Italy, beautiful Italy, extending from sea to sea and across the Alps. And that northeast corner where the Dolomites are is something that Italy covets very, very much. However, there's much more to it. Italy in 1885 was part of the Berlin Pact, that made a defensive pact that made it an ally of Germany and Austro-Hungary. And the agreement was that if either of those two nations were attacked, the three nations would go to war as allies. In 1914, 1915, Italy is going to claim that Germany and Austro-Hungary are the aggressors, and they are not bound by the attack, by the agreement. In the meantime, Great Britain is soliciting Italy, and there is the Pact of London that is reached in 1915, and it draws Italy into the war. Now, other people of a more skeptical, more cynical nature would say that Italy also was waiting to see who was likely to win the war, and was not willing to enter the war if it would be entering on a losing side. Italy's participation in the war was perhaps decisive, although we could argue from now till kingdom come over what was the decisive element, and perhaps with an event as complicated as the Great War was, there were 30 decisive elements, components. But Italy always contended that because of the attention that it required of Austro-Hungary, troops on that border, that northeastern border, it protected France's border and saved France as early as 1914. From being overwhelmed by the enemy forces.
Now, your book, as the title is Little Italy in the Great War, Philadelphia's Italians on the Battlefield. If you were to walk around Little Italy in 1914, 1915 in Philadelphia, where would you have been? Where in the city, and what would you have seen?
Well, Little Italy, of course, is a more of a metaphorical phrase than a precise geographical phrase. I think the principal claimant to Little Italy would, of course, be the large concentration of Italian Americans in South Philadelphia, below South Street, going all the way down to where the airport is today, pretty much from river to river, although in the early 20th century, Italians who were living in what we see as Little Italy today were very wary of the non-Italians on the other side of Broad Street. And I remember when I interviewed my men for my doctoral dissertation years ago, they said that it was dangerous to cross Broad Street because the Irish were there and the Irish would mug you. The Italians and the Irish have always had a love-hate relationship. But the principal Little Italy is in what we see as South Philadelphia today, the old section of South Philadelphia. It's probably the largest claimant to a Little Italy title of any city in the United States. I mean, there are other cities, for instance, New York has a huge population that lives in its Little Italy, and other cities, many other cities can claim to have a Little Italy with substantial populations. But the so-called Little Italy of Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, is a vast geographical tract.
How many people in there?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that question because that is, again, a very elusive question. I think what you're really also asking me is how many Italians were there, maybe. In the early 20th century, as we approached the war, there are all kinds of numbers being bandied about. The Italian newspapers, the foreign language newspapers in South Philadelphia, are saying anywhere from 120,000 to 200,000. And if you go into the suburbs, an even greater number, of course. The Italian consulate is grabbing onto that number and kind of officially validating it as the accurate number. But it's hard to answer because we're talking about people born in Italy, people born in the United States, children to Italian-born parents. And we're talking about people of later generations that can trace their presence in Philadelphia as far back as the 1850s, 1860s, when they first began to come in modest numbers, exploding in the 1880s. So it's an elusive number, and still to this day. When I first started doing my research, I remember in the mid-1960s, when I first became attracted to the question of Italians as immigrants to Philadelphia, the most recent census, the 1960 census, identified Italians in terms of Italian-born and Italian stock, those who were born in Italy and those who were born in the United States of at least one Italian-born parent. The Italians were the largest ethnic population in Philadelphia, the largest white ethnic population in Philadelphia, I should say.
Did they tend to stick together or in their enclave, or did they spread out through the city?
And I should also add, before I finish your question about Little Italy, there were other Little Italies. There are satellite communities in other areas.
In the Philadelphia
West
area?
Philadelphia had Little Italy West. North Philadelphia had Little Italy North. There are suburban communities in places like Stratford, where there were little clusters that were originally settled out there because they were gardeners and going into landscape work, railroad workers who found it easier to live out there than to live in the city. But there were a number of satellite communities, maybe 10, 12, 15 recognizable satellite communities, often clustered around a national parish, a national church that was Roman Catholic, but allowed sermons in Italian, and living in a kind of tense relationship with the central organized Catholic Church, because there was what the hierarchy referred to as the Italian problem. Italians, when they arrived, seemed to, in unacceptably large numbers, defect from Catholic membership. And if they did not defect, they were not as generous with their almsgiving as other ethnic groups were. So the bishops and archbishops in the United States, as well as the central authority in Rome, had to deal with this so-called Italian problem. And they were searching for solutions. Part of it was to give Italians their own churches. The church that I wrote about in my second book, Priest, Parish, and People, is the first Italian church in the United States for the exclusive use of Italians. That was formed in 1852, 1853, 1854, and historically very, very important. It was recently closed as a parish about 10 years ago. But the parishes were very important as a device that served to cluster the Italians. When you get up to some areas, though, there were strange, very strange expressions of all of this. In what is now the Diocese of Allentown, there was at least one church I know that faced, I think it was actually on Garibaldi Place, which doesn't make any sense because Garibaldi was very anti-clerical, and but it reflects the kinds of contradictions that all people face in their daily lives, trying to sort out things.
Why would all those Italians have left Italy to come to Philadelphia?
Well, Philadelphia was a place of great opportunity. Italy was not a place of great opportunity. It was a very difficult kind of choice. This was one of the things that at the very beginning of my research I was intrigued by. Why would you want to leave Italy? And those of us that have visited Italy and looked at the beauty of Italy, the physical beauty of Italy, have often asked that question: why would people want to leave this area? And the second question becomes, how the heck did they ever get out of here, too? Because transportation was not what it is today. But life was very difficult for ordinary Italians, especially through the southern regions. I remember seeing an interview that was published in a South Jersey newspaper some years ago, where an immigrant informant to a reporter said it in a beautifully succinct sort of way, the way that scholars strive to get a nice, neat, pat phrase, and he said it so simply and so incisively. He said, I left Italy, I left my family because it was the only way I could help my family. What I like to emphasize is that they did not come, however, so much for any so-called American dream, but it was for an Italian dream. Because when I interviewed my men back in the late 60s, early 70s, and I asked them, did you intend to stay here when you came? And they, for the most part, said they weren't sure. Plans were uncertain. But in the back of most minds, I think they had hoped to go back to Italy because they were sending as much money as they could in remittances through immigrant banks and through the postal services back to Italy to raise the quality of life for the family they had left behind. My own father, when he came in 1922, came with the sense that he was going to earn enough money to provide dowry for the sisters, the several sisters that he left behind. Unfortunately, he got trapped in America, and I think, of course, what happens is you do discover a good life, materially speaking, in the United States.
Were jobs available to them when they got here?
Yes. The jobs were difficult. The jobs were dangerous. The jobs were very demanding. The jobs were thankless in many instances. This is not a country that welcomes them with open arms at the highest levels. One of the things that I've come across in more recent research, which strikes at my heart, are newspaper accounts of railroad accidents. The Italians who worked on the railroads were not so much building the lines had already been built by Asian and Irish laborers in earlier years, but they were track maintenance workers. The wooden ties had to be regularly replaced, so they would knock out the old disintegrated ties and replace them. It was very, very dangerous work. They had to have guards posted in distant locations who would warn them of approaching trains, which didn't always work out. They were dealing with dynamite, which they did not know how to use, and there's some incredible tales of men lighting dynamite, men trying to warm wet dynamite so they could use it to explode sites, deliberately explode sites, who died in this very dangerous work. And when you see the newspaper accounts, what you read is 12 Italian laborers died on the Reading tracks yesterday. And then you read their identities. Track worker 12, track worker 13, track worker 14. In the foreman's book, there is no name listed, only a number given as an identification of the worker. So there's this enormous sadness that I feel, and in my study at home, I can look from my windows out at the main line railroad tracks, and I often wonder if men died close to my house, and they were among these men who died nameless. But it kind of captures in a kernel, in a nutshell, the difficult, dirty, and dangerous work that many immigrants, and again, not just Italians, but Poles and the Irish had gone through it earlier. A lot of immigrant groups were experiencing the same challenging life.
Did Italians encounter much anti-Italian sentiment? Was there much anti-Italian sentiment that they found?
Yes, there was Italian sentiment, anti-Italian sentiment. There was a great deal of confusion about Italians racially. The Italians are the only group in the official immigration records of the United States to be separated by region. In the famous Dillingham Commission report, which conveys the annual immigration reports of the federal government. When Italian numbers are given, they are always divided into Northern Italian and Southern Italian. And the Southern Italian introduced a racial element as well, too, because there are congressional investigations where some of our honorable representatives from our southern states are asking if these men are members of the white race. Because the Italians also found themselves in southern locations in great proximity to black Americans with whom they went to school, with whom they shared housing, with whom they shared the territory, the immediate geographical locations. And I tend to think that the kind of racist sentiment that Italian Americans of later generations get labeled with sometimes were something that resulted from becoming Americanized. That in their earlier years, they didn't know when they first arrived they were supposed to dislike blacks because they were living peaceably with blacks. And alongside of black Americans, and I hope most people know the tragic history of violence against black Americans, Italians were also subject to terrible episodes, several terrible episodes of anti-Italian violence, the most important being the 1893 lynching in New Orleans, in which 11 Italians are exonerated from charges that they killed the chief of police, who on his, supposedly, as he dies, he says, the Dagos did it. And they arrest a bunch of Italians. They are brought to hearings in New Orleans. They are exonerated, and they are to be released from the jail when a mob of white citizens removes them from the jail, hangs them, and shoots them mainly outside of the jail in a terrible act of violence that caused an international episode between Italy and the United States. The principal diplomat, the ambassador to the United States from Italy, went to see the Secretary of State, I think it was Secretary of State James G. Blaine, and walked out in anger from his office as they tried to negotiate some scheme of reparations for the Italian families that had been victimized by this kind of thing. And Italy was threatening to send warships, Italy at that time having a more formidable navy than the United States had, warships to threaten American ports. We were on the verge of war with Italy as a result of that episode. And incidentally, one other thing I'd like to point out about that episode, I have followed it carefully through archival copies of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And the day after the lynching, the word mafia occurs in the Inquirer for the very first time in print in the Inquirer. I can't find it at any earlier date on the pages of the Inquirer. It had been circulating in other places, particularly in New Orleans, which is very much an Italian city more than a French city, but a very large Italian migration there, and largely of Sicilian origin too.
Where in Italy did the Italians in Philadelphia primarily come from?
Okay, the earliest Italians who founded the community, and that was the subject of my first book that we met years ago to talk about building Little Italy. They were Ligurian. They were from the region that contains the city of Genoa. So they came from far up on the peninsula, on the western side, way up on the northwestern corner.
This is the early 1800s?
They began coming, I begin to see men who are connected with one another in migrant chains as early as about 1812, 1815, where you get men who are coming from Ligurian villages. They're actually coming from hill towns that are in an area called the Val Fontana Buona, the valley of the good fountain. And it was a slate mining area. And they mined open pit mining of slate brought down to the city of Chiavari, wonderful city on that coast, and shipped everywhere. But the Genovese also had a tradition of sending people all over the world as merchants, as beggars, as street musicians, as all kinds of things. And by the 1850 census, you begin to see a little cluster of them just outside the southern limits of Philadelphia. Well, in 1854, when Philadelphia is consolidated, modern Philadelphia is consolidated with new boundaries, and the districts of South Wark and Passyunk and Moyamensing are drawn into the new city, consolidated city of Philadelphia, and we can begin to think about an area that we're going to call South Philadelphia eventually. It is largely a Ligurian community. That first church, if you look at the names of the original families that appear on baptismal records, for example, they are coming from these towns outside of Genoa.
And then when mass migration
mass migration starts, it shifts tremendously to the south. Again, this is the kind of thing that when I'm with friends from South Philadelphia especially, we might argue over. It depends upon what your own personal background is to some extent. I would contend from a scholarly point of view, but it's also from a personal point of view, that the greatest representation was from the Abruzzi, which was at that time the Abruzzo and Molise. My father's family originates in Molise. They split in 1950s into two different regions, but back then they are referred to as the Abruzzi, and they are the Abruzzo and Molise, two regions, a single region at that point, and they come in huge numbers. But great numbers are also coming from Sicily, unquestionably, from Basilicata, from Puglia. And if you go through the population and ask people about their backgrounds, from Campania, you'll find almost all of southern Italy represented.
Were there good Italian restaurants from the very beginning, or is that something that evolved when they got here?
Interesting question. I have unpublished pages of another manuscript that describes a Civil War chef that had achieved a great reputation, who opened a very fancy restaurant by the 1870s, 1880s. You begin to get things that reflect and challenge Delmonico's in New York. These are not corner spaghetti joints. You begin to get at one point in this book, I talk about the celebrations that are going on as the war comes to an end. And a good bit of the geographical focus, the spatial focus, is on restaurants. Several of them named for prominent Italian political or military figures. How good they were, I don't know. Again, this is something friends argue over. When you've been raised in an Italian family and have had the benefit of an exquisite cook who is your mother or your grandmother who is an exquisite cook, it's hard to find satisfaction in many restaurants. And we can be pretty snobbish about that and say, oh, my mother cooked much better than any restaurant I've ever found. But there were popular restaurants, and the restaurants, I think, were very important in terms of integrating the Italians as a population into Philadelphia, because the restaurants were a magnet drawing other Italians into. And I have a wonderful quotation that hasn't appeared in anything I've written yet from Christopher Morley, who was a great, famous writer, Philadelphia writer, of course, who praises South Philadelphia and basically says, why would anybody want to live anywhere else? I mean, it's extravagant praise that he gives to South Philadelphia. And it makes you wonder. Now, my family slipped out of South Philadelphia at a very early point. Both my father had lived with relatives in North Philadelphia when we first arrived. My mother had lived for about a year with her parents in a house on Reed Street in South Philadelphia when they first arrived. But they pretty quickly found their way over to Camden. And we always felt, as we were growing up, that we had improved the quality of our lives. And we looked with some measure of disdain, I must confess, on those we had left behind in South Philadelphia. But now, as I go through it in a vicarious sort of way, and I read about South Philadelphia in 1910 or 1920 or 1930, I get a great sense this must have been a fabulous place to live. It must have been a place of great joy.
You said early on in the program that when Italy entered World War I, there was a burst of patriotic fervor among the Italians in Philadelphia.
Yes.
How did it show itself? What did they do?
They took to the streets. They marched in the streets. Bands, any Italian community has a dozen bands, marching bands, colorful marching bands. And the bands marched in the streets, and people poured out of the houses with American flags and Italian flags. Even though the United States was not yet in the war, they knew they were part of the United States, but they came out mainly with Italian flags, and they marched behind the bands, and they marched all over the city. They marched from South Philadelphia into Center City. They stopped traffic. They froze industrial establishments. Workforces walked out to celebrate what was the news they were receiving from Italy, which was very important.
And you say that quite a number of them volunteered for the Italian army.
Well, this is an interesting question, and this is, I think, one of the core questions of what I'm trying to deal with in this book. When the war breaks out, the Italian government, the consulate office in Philadelphia, announces that men who were born in Italy, who have not become American citizens, have a military obligation to serve in Italy. They are reservists in the Italian army. And if they ignore that obligation, the implication is they will be seen as deserters, subject to punishment. Okay? The early figures that I see that were being circulated at the time in 1915, approximately maybe 20,000 men, young men, who are in the Philadelphia Consular District, which goes down to Northern Virginia, incidentally, but it includes Delaware and New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania. And they are being told they are obligated to report to the consulate office, to identify themselves, and to be preparing themselves to be shipped back to Italy. Now, there's a problem here for the Italian government because it doesn't have the ships. It quickly exhausts the shipping that it needs to send them back to Italy.
Well, yeah, you write in here that the Italian government expected volunteers not only to enlist promptly, but to pay their own way.
Yes. They were not allocating money to pay for these men. The men were expected. There was another issue that pops up in public discourse. Where's the money going to be coming from to finance these men going back? You get interesting in the Italian language press, again, advertisements for household goods being sold, in part because we don't need them anymore if we're going back to Italy, but also I need to pay my way back to Italy.
Were the Italian citizens living in the U.S. perfectly willing to go off in the army?
The interesting thing is not nearly as many reported. The newspapers give them great attention. And there are wonderful photographs, which I found, and I tried to get into the book too, of men jamming the front doorsteps of the consulate, answering the call. And the newspapers play it up tremendously because ships will leave from Philadelphia as a port on the way to New York to pick up other reservists, and claim that 2,000 or 3,000 men got on the ship in Philadelphia. And there are wonderful scenes on the docks of Philadelphia, which I've given a lot of attention to, because they come with musical instruments to play their farewell. There are these terrible parting scenes because many of the men are married and are leaving wives and children, and these terrible parting scenes on the docks because, of course, the families don't know if they'll ever see the husband, father ever again. But the number of men that actually went back was fairly small compared to the number that were supposed to go back. And they remained a bone of contention. Renitente, they were called. They were the resistors. They were the draft resistors. And they remained resistors as reservists. Now, many of the men do go back. And when I eventually get to the men who were drafted into the U.S. Army, who either volunteered or were drafted and ended up in the U.S. Army on the Western Front, and I go into details of what happened to them on the Western Front, and you get these little vignettes, which I've been able to cull from Philadelphia newspapers, of men who were wounded on the Western Front or killed on the Western Front. You get these very poignant lines of information that Alberto also has two brothers who are serving in the Italian army or have already died on the Italian front as members of the Italian army. You get a number of families, some of which have parents here and some of which have parents left behind in Italy.
Do you have any reports of what the experience was like for the the Italian Americans who were in the Italian army when they got over?
Yes, but I think it doesn't go as far as you would like me to go with it, because I do have accounts that are probably cleaned up a bit, because a good bit of what was communicated back from the battlefields, all of it was under censorship. And the information that appears in newspapers, you have to take with a grain of salt. But these men are quoted about and we're even getting letters to their families, which were also censored. And the men describe battlefield conditions. They describe them in a way in which the information is not much different than any other soldier would give. It's good on a certain level, in a certain fashion, it's good. And there's lots of heroic stuff described, and the usual hatred for the enemy, and the good times and everything. There's one very long series that takes place of published articles that takes place from Fort Meade, Maryland, where the bulk of Philadelphia men were sent to be prepared for overseas duty. And a mainstream American named Bob, who was a correspondent, supposedly sending letters back to his mother in Philadelphia, his mother and sisters in Philadelphia. When you reach the end of it, you scratch your head and you say, I wonder how authentic any of this was. Bob talks about encountering Italian soldiers from Philadelphia, and he describes the growing appreciation that I have. I've never met an Italian guy before, and he's become my good camp buddy here, and all this kind of thing. And there was a very well-known attempt by military officials to create a very favorable image of the whole war experience, beginning with the camp and training experience, that this was great fun by boys. It was like college kids on a summer camp kind of thing, and we're having a wonderful time. And we're going to have a wonderful time when we get over to the front, too, which is quite the opposite of what actually occurs.
So were Italian citizens who were living in Philadelphia, the immigrants, were they subject to the American draft?
Okay, if they made any gesture towards becoming an American citizen, they became eligible for the draft. If they refrained from any of that, they were protected by an 1871 law that protected American citizens in Italy and Italian citizens in the United States. They were not subject to any kind of call to duty by the government of that country where they found themselves. The United States had to deal with this because there were too many men who had not made any move towards citizenship. So again, there's a little bit of nibbling here and there. How do we get these men to come closer to the citizenship process? The U.S. government establishes citizenship courts at the bases, and you get these accounts of 600 foreign-born soldiers swear citizens, take the oath of citizenship at Fort Dix or at Fort Meade or at some other Fort Gordon in Georgia, another place where many of our local boys went. You realize that there was a very energetic effort to get these boys moving towards American citizenship so that that could justify their conscription into the U.S. Army.
And you mentioned there was an Italian brigade. It was in the Pennsylvania militia.
Yes.
Did they keep the Italians together, or did they mix them throughout the Army?
Again, a hard question to answer without going into more detailed information, which is probably available in Washington, but I did not take advantage of that. I did not look at it. The Italian brigade that is featured on the cover of the book reflects a group of men who joined together in the Pennsylvania National Guard, as I mentioned before. When it's federalized, they go over and are held together, but many of them were also distributed into other units as well. What you have in the Italian case is most men going into the infantry. You occasionally find Italians in the Navy, but that's very rare, very, very rare. And they probably had to be rather Americanized Italians to be acceptable for service in the Navy. The Navy was very, very reluctant. The Navy dragged its heels with foreign recruits with blacks. Even in the Second World War, black Navy personnel were cooks on ships and very limited service. So this is a very difficult problem for the American Armed Forces to work out in terms of how they're going to dispose of these men. The ordinary Italian was most likely to find himself in the infantry, and in the infantry on the Western Front.
Did many Italian Americans in the American Army, were they assigned to Italy? Did any of them fight in Italy?
Okay. Many of them thought they were going to be assigned to Italy because it made all sense in the world to go to Italy. The Italians anticipated that the United States would come to the aid of Italy with monetary loans to finance, this is very interesting, to finance the purchasing of arms and ammunition from American industries. It was going to go back to America. There was a circular path, which makes you very suspicious about what was going on there, but also with military aid to Italy. The United States disappoints Italy tremendously because it not only doesn't send much military aid to Italy, even though it trains. The U.S. Army Air Corps has a very important training center outside of Bari, the city of Bari. And the beginnings of the U.S. Naval Air Service is outside of Rome. They're trained in Italy. The Italians are assuming they're going to be bombing Austrians on the Austrian front, the Austro-Italian front. They make a couple of forays. LaGuardia, Fiorello LaGuardia is among them, but he's quickly taken out of combat service. He was the commander of the training base at Bari, and he's sent on a speech tour to major Italian cities to address the Italians. And again, if you look at the remarks which are published in American newspapers of what he said in Milan, for example, at the great opera house in Milan, at the La Scala, he's almost promising American troops will be coming in large numbers. The United States actually sends one combat regiment, the 332nd Regiment, which was a Ohio National Guard unit that had been federalized. It's not an Italian-American unit. It's made up of all kinds of boys, all kinds of backgrounds. They reach Italy toward the end of the war, and there's a very slow movement of the 332nd Regiment toward the front. They do some very interesting things, and men in their memoirs, men who were members of the unit in their memoirs, document this very, very clearly. They would march through an Italian village and then be brought back to base, change their uniforms, and be trucked to another village in a different type of uniform and made to appear as if it was a different unit. And then in the evening appear in a third location in yet a different kind of uniform. German soldiers, Austrian soldiers rather, when they were captured after the end of the war, said that they believed that there were 2 million Americans in action in Italy. There actually was no more than about 2 or 3,000. When they went into combat, they went into actual combat on the morning of November 4th, which I mentioned earlier in our conversation, the day the armistice is signed. They have no more than about 10 minutes of actual engagement with the enemy. And they are told in village after village, if you boys had reached here a half hour ago, you would have had resistance from the Austrians. But they are in full flight now. They have disappeared. They're down the road 30 kilometers, and there's no resistance. I think one American soldier was killed. There were a dozen or so who were wounded. There were a couple others who were killed in training accidents, but it was a farce, and it was made to look like America had delivered the goods, but the United States really hadn't.
What was going on the home front? If you walked around Little Italy and all these boys were off in Europe, what had changed?
Well, there was a great deal of patriotic fervor. The display of the emblems that indicated our boy is over in service in Europe, or our boy has died. These were emblems of great honor in the First World War as well as the Second World War. There were frequent demonstrations on periodic occasions. Again, the churches are very important because the priests are very patriotic, both for the Italian cause and the American cause. And on holidays that were once spiritual holidays, the feast day of a particular saint, they become converted into political events in which we are celebrating the glories of the U.S. Armed Forces in France.
Were there Rosie the Riveter types in World War I, women who went into the
Okay, this is
defensive
something that I tried to get to, but the industrial records are not as accessible as I would have hoped they would have been. The one glimpse of an industrial presence of Italian workers, particularly women, in a chapter that I devoted to women and children, is when the great explosion occurs at the Eddystone ammunition factory, Remington factory in Eddystone in Delaware, just across the border in Delaware. When you look at the names of the casualties, you see a handful of Italian names and with Philadelphia addresses, and you realize that Italian girls and women were commuting from Philadelphia into Delaware to work in the ammunition factories, which of course, when these explosions occur, and there was another in North Philadelphia in Frankfurt, the immediate sense is German saboteurs, spies in our midst are responsible for this. There was never any indication in the Philadelphia instances, either at Eddystone down there in Delaware or in the Frankfurt explosion, that German agents had anything to do with this, enemy agents had anything to do with this. These were accidents that occurred due to faulty shop practices.
Were there fundraisers or relief efforts?
Yes, yes, the Liberty Bond efforts. The great Liberty Bond drives, which we have, 5 or so drives. Italian women participated from the third drive on in great numbers. There were specially designated Italian units. And I have a wonderful photograph I'm very proud of a group of women. I think it's in the 3rd or 4th Liberty Bond drive that appears in the book. And as I looked at the names of the women in there, I recognized one was my baptismal godmother and an old friend of the family. Many years later, my path crossed with hers, but she was, as a young woman, one of these door-to-door solicitors who would canvass the leaders of the Italian community, made extravagant promises when the bond drives began. The bond drives began as Italian bond drives because there were similar things going on in Italy before the United States enters the war.
So they were raising money to send over to Italy?
They were raising money for the Italian Red Cross. They were raising money for a variety of different applications, hopefully. A lot of the money goes in uncertain directions that no one knows what happens to it. But when the United States enters the war, they become part of the Liberty Bond drives that we associate with Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin and Enrico Caruso singing over there. But they went through the communities too, and they mobilized young Italian women. And the newspapers described them. If you are on the corner of Broad and Christian Street and you see the pretty dark-eyed lass handing you a flower, give her some money in return, and you realize that she's from the Italian community and she's part of this solicitation of funds to support the financing of the war in the Liberty Bond drives that were going on even till after the war. The last Liberty Bond drive occurs, I think, in 1919, because we still have debt to pay.
When the war ended and the soldiers in the Italian army were released from the army,
yeah.
Did any of them stay in Italy, or did they generally
Many of them
come
stayed in Italy. Many of them came back. Toward the end of the book, I get into this a little bit. But again, there's no easy way of coming to numbers to be able to say that 50% came back and 50% stayed. You just can't do that. But I do get men returning from Italian Army service, and I do get men who stayed. And you also get, at that time, reverse migration of people who may have had nothing to do with direct involvement in the war, who want to return to Italy now that things have calmed down. They're anticipating prosperity in Italy. And they're fearful of the future of the American economy already. that maybe the next few years won't be as good as we want it to be. And maybe our better chance is to try to find work in Italy, which is an interesting reversal of the long enduring, more traditional pattern that we were talking about earlier.
Was there more acceptance of the Italians after the war, or more assimilation, or did they go back to the way it was before?
My very last, the epilogue of the book deals with this question, and I describe it in a kind of cynical sort of way, that the acceptance of Italians was not as great as they themselves may have thought it would be. The Americanization movement, which the war triggered, of conscious, deliberate effort. You can talk about the acculturation process in two ways. Acculturation as a natural experience that occurs to young boys and girls who go out to public schools, who go out to play on the sidewalks, and they're meeting Americans of all different kinds, and they're becoming Americanized by this natural evolutionary process. Or you can talk about acculturation as a matter of very conscious, deliberate policy. We're going to indoctrinate these people as Americans. And in that, you have, again, the public schools are very much involved in that, with Americanization classes, with citizenship classes, in evening schools, and in the regular curricula, too. But the Americanization movement accelerates after the war, actually. It was introduced during the war in order to guarantee the allegiance of the foreign-born, because when the war breaks out, we don't know where the foreign-born are going to fall. And even those that are part of allied countries, we don't know how much enthusiasm they're going to have for the American cause. So we have to Americanize them. We have to get them to shift, to share the same commitments and the same enthusiasm as other Americans would have. But when the war ends, it accelerates. I have a document at home of a program that the Chamber of Commerce and a whole bunch of other noble institutions of Philadelphia all collaborated on Americanization in Philadelphia. I think it's dated 1923 or so. And they have a very elaborate program of trying to pick up the lives of these young people of foreign ancestry. And the whole notion of the hyphenated American was a provocative, controversial, explosive thing. I mean, the hyphenated American, you get prominent figures like former President Theodore Roosevelt saying, there is no room for the hyphenated American.
You quote an article from the Inquirer in 1915 saying that very thing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's all over the place. The whole notion of a hybrid identity is anathema to many Americans. It is just totally unacceptable. It creates a difficult kind of circumstance because you have people certainly who want to become Americanized in some senses, but they do not want to cut themselves off entirely from their past because it involves a rejection of their own parents and grandparents, and they're asking, well, what was wrong with what we have been? And can't we become something? It's a more pluralistic view of America. Can't we become something new and different, but at the same time hold what I cherish from the past? So I go into that in the last chapter, my epilogue chapter, because I feel that has lingered on as a question and remains an issue today. It disturbs a great deal of Americans who look at the Latinos in our population and are very troubled by these people who don't want to give up Spanish. I mean, my feeling is, why can't we be a multilingual nation? What's so threatening? What's so detrimental? What's so non-productive about people who have a facility in another language? I say, welcome it. It's wonderful. I envy them.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. We've been speaking with Richard Juliani. He is the author of this book, Little Italy in the Great War, Philadelphia's Italians on the Battlefield and Home Front. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.